Hi, my name is Sparrow, and I'm a science communicator with a background in behavioral science and pedagogy, which is the science of teaching. This week's topic is shapes of Earth, and I've actually decided to split it into two videos in the interest of time. This video is on hollow Earth theory. The basic concept behind hollow Earth is that Earth has a space inside of it in which beings or people live. There are many variations of the theory, which I've simplified into four sort of basic concepts. The first being that there's a singular large space with its own internal sun. The second is that there are sort of concentric hoops or layers of spaces which have a glowing gaseous atmosphere that provides the light that things need to live. There is also a sort of honeycomb of caverns idea, and lastly, concave Earth, which is the idea that we are the ones on the inside. A lot of different factors contributed to people's willingness to believe in these ideas, which were prevalent from around the mid-1600s until the mid-1900s. One factor towards the believability of Hollow Earth was mythology and religion. Most religions on Earth include some sort of a underground realm, whether it's called Hades or Svartalfheim or Sheol or Patala or Shambhala or whatever else. Basically, every religion on Earth includes some sort of beings that live underground. In addition to this, for those who are not religious, there is also the myth of fairies. Basically, every culture has some sort of variation of fairies, and especially in Europe, it was a pretty widespread belief that elves or gnomes or pixies sort of lived underhill. So these sort of ideas were bouncing around in people's heads and made it easier to accept this idea of a hollow earth as being like, oh, okay, that makes sense with the things I've already heard of and know. There was also a lot of pop culture interest in the topic and a lot of fictional narratives going around that spread awareness of the idea, which further contributed to people being willing to accept it. Lastly, there was the trusted source fallacy, or what I'd like to call the celebrity effect. People knew of big names who were fans of the theory, including big names in science, such as a man who was deemed the modern Da Vinci and master of 100 arts. With all of these big name people supporting the idea, it became very easy for people who weren't part of the science community to just sort of believe it. The science community, on the other hand, was really torn on the topic. There were lots of big debates about it, with some of them being won by the solid Earth side and others being won by the hollow Earth side. And there were also a good number of people who were planning experiments aiming to prove or disprove the hollow Earth. Three of the biggest names in hollow Earth are John Cleve Sims, James McBride, and J.M. Reynolds. The three of them all sort of decided that the best way to determine whether or not the Earth was hollow was to go inside it. Which, honestly, that makes a lot of sense. If the Earth's hollow, you should be able to get there. Sims was a proponent of the concentric hoops idea and believed that the aurora borealis and aurora australis were gaseous emissions from inside of the hollow Earth, and their colors were because that's what the sky looks like in there. He further believed that at the North and South Poles, there were sort of holes leading into the hollow Earth that he would be able to climb down into if he was able to get there. And so he and James McBride worked together to try and raise money for an expedition. Something that's interesting to note on this topic is that John Clave Sims did not make money off of Hollow Earth theory. In fact, he actually went so deep into debt that when he died, his son had to spend years paying for his debts. However, he became very famous as kind of the big name of Hollow Earth. He was the Hollow Earth guy. And to this day, there are very few, if any, publications that mention the topic without either quoting him or referencing his works. James McBride, on the other hand, made money and got a lot of fame, and he was sort of a big name in the debates circuit. Unfortunately, the two of them were never able to raise enough money to fund an expedition to the North Pole, and by the time Sims died, they had sort of given up on the idea. For clarity, they'd given up on the idea of the expedition. They did both firmly still believe that the Earth was hollow. J.M. Reynolds, on the other hand, had a lot more luck with expeditions. Not necessarily good luck, but we'll get into that later. He came at it with a sort of two-pronged approach. He was trying to raise money for his expedition, but he was also trying to raise support with the scientific community, claiming that this was very vitally important to understanding Earth. And that worked. The biggest scientific organization of the time decided that they should fund an expedition to the South Pole, as well as various other places, to explore and determine if the Earth was hollow, what's inside of volcanoes, and various other big science questions of the time. But they didn't want Reynolds along for the ride. He had become pretty closely associated with Hollow Earth in the sort of public mind at this time, and so they believed that if they brought him along, people would think he had skewed their results and committed fraud, basically. So they told him, yeah, we're going to go on your expedition, but you're not going. So Reynolds continued fundraising and was eventually able to set off on his own expedition. Reynolds believed that the Earth was a non-spherical globe. He believed that the centrifugal motion that created days was also having a flattening effect on the planet, and therefore it was more of a donut shape. And he believed that if you reached the South or North Pole, it would be so flat, in fact, that you could walk down into the hollow Earth without actually having to climb or even needing like a staircase. Now, in today's age, we know that that's silly. But at the time, it was about as reasonable as every other theory, and so he was able to put a crew together and they set sail for Antarctica. However, along the way, his crew mutinied and they stranded him in Chile, along with his artist that he had hired to draw whatever mysterious people they found down there. He didn't just sit around waiting to be rescued, though. He actually started studying the various plants and animals, including sea life, in and around Chile. And most famously, he became very interested and invested in a particular whale. Now, I'll fully admit this is sort of a side story and not directly related to Hollow Earth, but I found it interesting and I thought you might too. Basically, there was a white sperm whale that was often seen around the Mocha Islands and gained the name Mocha Dick. Now, Mocha Dick was friendly to ships and would sometimes just swim alongside them and even up into harbors. And Reynolds ended up seeing rather a lot of this whale and noticing patterns to where the whale would be at different times of year. He was eventually rescued by the RMS Carpathia, and that ship went on to circumnavigate the globe sort of accidentally, bouncing from one rescue location to another as they picked up various shipwrecked or marooned people along the way. Which, side note, is just absolutely fascinating to me, considering how difficult it was to organize both this South Pole trip and various circumnavigation journeys of the time. But anyways, Reynolds got back to Europe and he published a book on his observations of Mocha Dick the white whale. And that book went on to become the inspiration for Herman Melville's Moby Dick. With the failure of the Just Go There plan, scientists had to come up with another way to test whether or not the Earth was hollow. What they came up with was actually pretty genius, although I will be the first to admit that the experiment was also very flawed. This experiment became known as the Schiehallion Mountain Experiment, which I hope I am pronouncing correctly, but it didn't actually start with Mount Schiehallion. Let's talk about gravity. The fact of gravity is that stuff fall down. But the theory behind gravity is that the reason stuff falls down is that large masses, such as the Earth, pull things towards their center. Using that logic, scientists of the time determined that a large mass, such as a mountain, would distort that downward pull of gravity in a measurable way. They further theorized that they could calculate, based on the mass of the mountain, exactly how far it would distort gravity, and then by comparing the actual distortion to the theorized distortion, they could determine whether or not the Earth had the same density of the mountain or was in fact hollow. Now, this is absolutely genius. This is such a straightforward experiment, and it's one that could be performed basically at any mountain by any person with very simple tools. All they needed was a way to measure distances, to set up their stations, and at least 2 stations with pendulums. When I talk about pendulums, just as a side note, I'm using the sort of witchy term of a weight on a string used to measure things rather than the clock term where it's, going side to side in a regular beat. This is important because the purpose of these pendulums would be to create that distorted fall, and they would be using them to measure the angle of the line and to determine how far away from plumb, straight vertical, those lines were. Now, Schiehallion was not the first mountain they did this on. They did a test run on a different mountain and determined that the concept worked, but since they didn't know enough about that mountain, they couldn't prove Earth hollow or solid using it because they didn't know if the mountain was hollow or solid. So they repeated the experiment with Schiehallion and determined that the pull of the mountain was in line with their calculations, and therefore the density of the mountain matched the density of the Earth, and it could not be hollow. So, who made money off this? Who profited? Well, of course, we've already talked about John Clay Sims, who did not make money but did get famous, and James McBride and J.M. Reynolds. But there was also Lady Paget, the super grifter, who was an occultist and a friend of the Queen. She published a book claiming to be communing with the unseen spirits of people who lived within the earth, and a lot of people believed it. There were various science writers who made claims that were obviously false about their discoveries regarding the hollow earth. And there were also science writers who expounded on ideas and theorized and came up with projected experiments to prove or disprove Hollow Earth, and all of them made money from their publications. There was a man, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, George Papashvili, who was an American immigrant and published a memoir in which he claimed, rather casually, to have stumbled upon the secret entrance to the Hollow Earth, gone there and met people there, and then come home and just kind of not told anybody about it. And he gained sort of a following for that. There were fiction writers like Jules Verne and Edgar Allan Poe who capitalized on the idea, but I don't consider them to be grifters because they didn't attempt to deceive anyone. And lastly, in the mid-1900s, there was a whole new breed of Hollow Earthers who tied the idea of the Hollow Earth in with the idea of UFOs. And these people claimed to have found secret entrances to the Hollow Earth and to have witnessed UFOs or spacecraft going in and out. Some of them claimed that aliens from space had alliances with the inner Earth dwellers, and others claimed that the inner Earth dwellers were, in fact, aliens colonizing our planet. And those people gained financial profit through tourism of people coming to their areas trying to find these supposed hidden entryways and having to, pay for things like hotel stays and food and tour guides. So those are the grifters of the Hollow Earth, the experiments that proved there was no Hollow Earth, and some of the basic ideas behind it. That's it for this video. If you like what you saw, please hit the like button, consider subscribing, and tune in for more videos of this type. I'll be posting the Flat Earth video here shortly.